Welcome to the Freshman Foundation Podcast, helping you make the jump from high school athletics to the collegiate level and beyond, with your host, Michael Huber.
Hey everyone, it's Mike Huber, founder and CEO of the Freshman Foundation and certified mental performance consultant. If you're listening to this episode, then you're likely a student athlete or family member of one. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Hopefully you find our podcast valuable. Mental performance coaching allows young athletes to show up at their best every single day by conquering distractions, pressures, and mental roadblocks through evidence-based strategies. So let's talk. You can visit my website at michaelv.com to schedule a free strategy session. Let's see if mental performance coaching is a fit for your family. Enjoy this episode, and thank you again for listening. How is Tim Williams helping young men set themselves up to thrive in the future? Adolescence can be very challenging. Moving from childhood into adulthood often comes with a great deal of confusion. Young people can benefit greatly from the wisdom and experiences of their elders in learning how to successfully operate in the world as an adult. My guest in this episode, Tim Williams, is a father and host of the Thrivehood Podcast. In episode 48, Tim discusses how his own experiences as a young man inspired him to share Thrivehood with the world. Tim is intent on helping young men to be in a position to thrive in life sooner rather than later. Perhaps more importantly, Tim is intent on leaving the world in a better place than where he found it. I'm excited for this conversation. Let's build your foundation with Tim Williams. Hey, Tim, how are you?
I'm sleepy.
Sleepy. Well, hopefully we can wake you up here a little bit.
Well, it's my own darn fault. We were talking before we hit the record button here, and I was out working out in my property, and I think I twisted something, and so I was feeling rough yesterday, and then today I got up, and I'm like, well, I'm going to probably need to hit the sack early tonight, so I don't know. Oh, when I was just telling you, I just took a quick nap before I ran out here to get with you, because I was like, just not feeling all that great, but life is good, man. Things are well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's great to see you again. Hope all is well with you. It sounds like it, other than maybe the typical ups and downs of everyday life.
Right,
but
right.
You know, it's interesting. You know, I had the chance to come onto your podcast, the Thrivehood Podcast, and what I've learned about podcasting and about these conversations is that they give me a lot of energy. Even on a slow day or a day where I'm feeling blah, like as soon as I get into a conversation with somebody, it sort of really picks me up and it kind of lifts me off for the rest of my day. So I love getting into conversations with people. It really helps me to sort of gives me the energy to get through the day.
Absolutely. That's that. I'm right there with you. So, but yeah, I said I was a little sleepy, but I was being more funny than anything else. So, hey, and by the way, you might, just so you know, maybe your listeners, I created a little podcast studio that has, of all things, a tin roof, and we're getting some rain. So if they hear some pitter patter in the background, that's what that is, in case they wonder.
Well, hopefully these fancy mics that we have in our respective studios will drown out that outside noise. But
yeah,
I guess the first question I wanted to ask you is, what inspired you to start your podcast, the Thrivehood Podcast?
Golly, it's a number of things, and I get asked that question a lot. I would say there's several things. First of all, probably first and foremost is some type of, I don't know if you really want to call it a legacy, but for the lack of a better way to explain myself, probably leaving some type of legacy behind for my children and future generations. I had just leaving a legacy is just very important. It's always been important to me, but I never really knew, like I've read about that and I've read books on it and I've heard about it, but I'm like, I don't quite know exactly, like when you put it into practical terms, what am I doing to leave the legacy? Like, let me put it in like, okay, let me walk this out. And, we can talk about, setting standards and being a good person and, investing in the world and all these other things. But I was like, I wish I had something tangible. Right. And I started thinking about, of course I speak primarily to young men, but, for my son and daughter, I was thinking, what, I just would like to have something where when I'm gone, wouldn't it be cool if there was a series of episodes that they could go back to and listen to? And when I'm gone, they still got Dad's voice and my somewhat offbeat humor and just some of the weirdness of who I am in general out there. So that was one reason. The other reason I did it was for a long time, Mike, and this has been for years and years and years, I would ask my wife, I would say, I want to help people. I want to give back somehow, but I don't know what that looks like. I can't, and she would say, what does it look like? I said, I don't have any idea. I don't know. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And she would say, you'll get there. You'll figure it out, which she, obviously I feel like this is really what I've been supposed to be doing was Thrivehood. But so that's taken me a number of long time to sort of figure out and try to process. And so, voila, I just decided to jump out and start this podcast. And then I think thirdly, it's a way to give back, just an opportunity to somehow to help society. I think I don't have to tell you, we, especially right now, we're in dire straits on a lot of levels and a lot of areas and a lot of different situations in our world. And gosh, if there's just something that I can share, a nugget or a piece of wisdom that I can give back, why not? Why not give that back? And Mike, I've never worked in social work. I don't have a degree in sociology, or I'm not a clinical psychologist, or I've never worked with juvenile. I've never done anything. It's just, I'm just a guy that has lived a life and pretty normal guy, but I'm just wanting to try to give back. And that's mainly why I started Thrivehood.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I relate to that on many levels. Certainly I do what I do because I want to help people. I never thought about the podcast as a way to leave something behind for my family, but I think that that's certainly relevant, right? I don't know if my kids are old enough to really appreciate it right now. They might be, maybe they're not, but one day they will, right? To know that their dad was able to, have these conversations with people about some things that are really important, and he cared about helping other people. I think that makes a big difference. So when you sort of conceived of the podcast, like what was it about that sort of teenage, young male, teenage male audience that stood out to you?
I would say twofold. I would say one had a little bit to do with my upbringing myself. I this is going to sound corny. I wish I could come to you and say, I grew up in a massively dysfunctional home, and my mom was an alcoholic, and my dad was a druggie, and he was hardly home, and he cheated on my wife all the time, and my mom all the time. And now, to be actually honest, it wasn't too bad. I mean, it was, I would say, average middle income family. We were raised in Indiana. My dad worked, my mom stayed home. But I think what happened as I got older and I look back, I realized there was just a lot of pivotal moments in my life, watershed moments that I just it would have been nice to have my mom and definitely my dad to come alongside and say, hey son, let me give you some pointers. Let me give you a little bit of advice. Let me, right here, I know that you want to manage life on your own, but you need your hand to be held for just a few minutes in this situation. And then we'll sort of let you get on the bike and see how you do. And there were just a number of pivotal moments, in my early teenage up to my early 20s. And I remember too, I was 19 and I had packed up all of my stuff, which wasn't much, but I packed up what I had because I was heading out to start a job in another state and was going to be driving, probably 5 or 6 hours away, and had my little car and little trailer and packed up my stuff. My mom and dad were so great. They gave me some of furniture they had to sort of get me
Mhm.
started and get me set up in an apartment. And I remember so vividly, my dad, he shook my hand. He said, well, son, he said, go out there and get it. You're on your own. And at the time, I didn't realize how much he truly meant that, because after that, it was, and I don't know, maybe it was just sort of his generation, but it was sort of a washing their hands of me and saying, I've done my part.
Mhm.
You just go ahead and figure life out after that,
Yeah.
And I sort of did. And I didn't get any calls. I didn't really get any follow-ups. I
Mhm.
didn't get a call saying, hey, how's it going? And I would call home, and once in a while I would talk to dad, but mostly he'd say, hey son, here's mom. And I wouldn't even talk to. And so there was just this
Mhm.
disconnect. And it took me a while. First of all, I was a little offended, right? I was a little
Right.
hurt. I was like,
Yes.
what's going on? What have I done wrong? But as I got older, I realized it was, and taking a step back a second, my mom and dad didn't have the greatest marriage. I mean, it was okay, but there were
Mhm.
issues, as I got older, I
Right.
realized,
As we all do, right?
there's some stuff going on here that I didn't realize, at the time. So I think I'm don't mean to drag this out, but
No, go ahead.
that experience was, I think, one reason for Thrivehood. The second reason was, now I'm raising two children of my own. Well, they're about ready to move out on their own. And not only just from my perspective of saying, which this, Mike, hey, you can learn just as much under poor leadership as you can under great leadership, right? Because you can simply say, I know what not to do. I know how to not treat people, not deal with circumstances, that sort of thing. So I think I was coming from that perspective with my children to say, I know what I'm not going to do. I know what I'm going to be aware of. And then I'm going to add in, who I am and why I'm about in raising my son and my daughter. And then also some of the people that they were around, and having minor conversations with young men that were hanging out with my son and even with my daughter, and just getting to know them. And I started seeing, Mike, just, gosh, there is a lot they don't know. There's a lot they don't understand. There's a lot that they're, and to no fault of their own. It's how it is, And I'm going, well, I don't know how qualified I am to talk to girls. I mean, that might even be a little creepy when you think about it, Thrivehood. Here's how a girl should handle,
right.
Whatever. But I knew I could at least talk to the young boys. I knew that I could at least, because in the podcast, I do have a number of parents and single moms and those people that listen in and that have told me, they said, this is really good. And I listened to it as well. So I realized after all that, okay, maybe I don't have a bunch of letters after my name, but I think I've got enough wisdom to just speak directly to these young boys. And at the end of the day, I want them to be able to contribute to society. I want them to be able to be, when it's all said and done, Mike, I'm going to finish with this. I want them to be better men, better friends, better husbands, better fathers, right? That's ultimately what better employees, better leaders, whatever role they're in. My hope is be better than what you think you can be, but you got to start right now.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things in there that I think are quite important. One is, as a parent, as you know, as I know, and I work with other people's kids in my business, even if parents are giving their children good guidance, children don't always listen to their parents because it's coming from their parents. So to be a voice from the outside that's much more objective, you can be delivering the same message that a father or mother delivers, but you may actually be more likely to be listened to because it's unbiased and there's not the same sort of relationship or attachment that a child has to a parent. And so, you're serving a purpose in that, because I hear that a lot from parents are saying like, hey, they're not really listening to me. Maybe they'll listen to you, right? Which is a privilege to be able to talk to somebody else's child and say, hey, this is what I think you might be able to do to put yourself in a better position to succeed. And to the parents' credit, I think that I get a lot of parents who come to me and say, hey, what do you think about this? Or how should I do this? Because sometimes it's like the relationship is so interconnected that we just drown each other out because we're always with each other or whatever. The other thing I think that's important is the way you described it is it's not necessarily the qualification, it's the intent, right? What's the intention? If your intention is to help other people and share your experiences and what you've learned over the last how many years of your life, like, yeah, I mean, sure, can we run afoul of a young person just out of, it could be dumb luck. We might say something that is taken the wrong way. But if you intend to help somebody and you have a good intention, then that's all you could do, right? Like most people don't even go out of their way with that good intention to try to help somebody else. They just worry about themselves.
Yeah. And if I may follow up on that.
Sure.
A good number of people, as a matter of fact, it's funny you're speaking of. Now I'm getting, I knew it. I knew you'd get me all jazzed up. Now I'm right awake and I'm into this, man. So good job, man. You got me out of my funk. But I'm like you. And when I get to talk about what I'm doing, I get excited because I'm trying to help in any way that I can.
Yeah.
When you look at what we would, and I even got a podcast episode about what success truly looks like. But if we're just talking from a perspective, maybe more materialistic of what people have achieved over and you know this, especially, you work in sports, how many different people that we can talk to in all walks of life, not just sports, but in all walks of life, that they came from less desirable circumstances and situations. And they just decided that they were going to excel, that they were going to succeed, that they were going to do something. Mm-hmm. And so when you come at it from the perspective of, we're talking again about me not having credibility. To be honest, that's really not what's required. Are you going to apply yourself? Are you going to push yourself? Do you have energy? Are you willing to do what needs to be done? Are you going to, I always tell my kids, we'll talk about different subject matters about life. And I'll always say this, you need to give 10% more than everybody else. That's all you got to do. 10% more. And if you start giving just a little more, what you're going to find out, you're going to be doing that more and more and more in life. And then all of a sudden, what's going to happen is this weird thing called luck that we so-called luck out there. Mm-hmm. You're going to start sort of finding yourself lucky, and you're going to go, wow,
Mm-hmm.
how come I fell into this? And how come this opened? Because you're working hard,
Mm-hmm.
You're doing what needs to be done. And so I feel like, well, maybe I don't have the credentials. I study, I look at what helps. I'm trying to provide, I'm trying to give back as much as I can. And you're right. If my desire is to truly help people, if these young boys out here listening, if their desire is to succeed, then I just did a podcast called 10 Things That Require Zero Talent. They need to listen to that because it's effort, being on time. It's just basic fundamentals about life that actually put you in a better position. And so I try to apply that to what I'm doing as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's stuff that I talk to young people about all the time, which is just controlling what you can control, which that includes your effort, that includes your attitude, that includes your preparation, right? Those are things that require no talent, to your point. And that subject of sort of compounding interests, right? Kind of, so to speak, of if you're consistent in putting in that little extra effort over time, what seems to be luck is really just the confluence of that effort finding itself in the right place. There's an opportunity. And I think that's hard because we live in a short-term oriented environment, right? Immediate gratification. That's pretty much universal, and whether it's, a sign of the times or is it just human nature or both, right? Everybody wants what they want right now, right? And we're always comparing ourselves to other people, right? We're looking at like, well, what's everybody else doing versus like, hey, if I just focus on me and the things that I'm doing, maybe it's not going to pay off for me right away, but I know that in the long run, it is going to pay off. And then to tie it back to what you said originally, which is to say, then I'm creating a legacy for myself because I'm doing the right things and I'm investing in my future, that people can look at me, whether it's my parents, my kids, friends, whoever, that I'm doing something that they can be proud of. And that is a legacy. When, you're gone, people look back and say like, hey, what was this guy all about? What was this character about? That's in short supply, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I like what you said there about the legacy thing. Okay. So somebody, who was it? You got me thinking now. Oh, Jim Gaffigan, the comedian. It was funny you were saying that about legacy and leaving things behind. And I like him because he sort of just takes real life things. And he once made a comment. He said, trying to find out about my DNA. He said, what is that all about? He said, you do realize that if you have somebody in your family tree that is of any value, you're already going to know about it. Who wants to know that my grandfather was the village idiot or the town drunk?
Right. We keep that quiet.
As soon as you do that DNA test, they're going to find out, oh, he was the village idiot. And it was so I think that's important that, you're, like you said, leaving a legacy is vitally important. And I think you can do that. I guess we sort of have this theme about a legacy, but I think that comes in many ways and it looks different for other people and in different situations and different families. But at the end of the day, what you and I are both, we're bookending this whole idea that, it's being the best version of yourself that you possibly can be.
Exactly.
And if you take a little bit from what you're doing, a little bit from what I'm doing, a little bit from, and you find it wherever you can find it, you pull it out and apply it to yourself. Then I think that's the key. That's, always striving to become better. And you talked about comparing. I think the comparison, and I may be wrong about this, but I think a good comparison is, am I a little better today than I was yesterday?
Right.
And will I be a little better tomorrow than I am today?
Right.
And that's how I look at it.
Comparing yourself to you versus comparing yourself to others, which you have absolutely no control of. But I wanted to ask you, so tell me more about the podcast. Tell me about who you're looking to have on as guests or who your guests are, and sort of what are some of the things you're talking about on the show? Yeah,
when I began the podcast, I was as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. I was just, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to do the wrong thing. Is anybody going to listen? They're even going to care? That was that's me being very vulnerable, which, hey, you know what, guys, we can actually be that once in a while, believe it or not. Yeah. And so I sort of jumped in with both feet, not really knowing what I was doing, and began soon realizing, I think it was almost, and I wasn't looking for it as a therapy, but I think it was therapy for me. It was just, well, you just said in the beginning of this podcast, I was getting charged up, and I'm realizing that, I'm offering ideas and suggestions and advice. And as I went through it, I was really trying to be very practical. Some of the initial, and I'm still doing that today, but some of the initial themes were really just helping young boys to be men. Well, what does it look like? Well, a rite of passage. What does it mean? At what point do you become a young man versus a boy, and what does that look like? And then some practical things. How do you shake hands? What degree of pressure should you have when you're shaking hands? Should you stand up when someone's coming to addressing you? Should you stay seated down? How do you handle shaking hands with a woman? Right? There's so many factors there. When we get into areas of, how to, recently was, like I said, what are 10 things that you should do? Maybe, you've got young men here that they're not really sure where they want to go, or what college they want. Maybe they don't even want to do college. Maybe they want to get into a trade school. Mm-hmm. Well, how do I know that? Well, start off with these 10 things that don't require talent, and let's just start there, and then apply these things to whatever career or profession maybe down the road that you're going to go after. So a lot of what it is, I just did one called essentials, essential items in your toolbox. If you're getting ready to move out on your first time and you need a little toolbox, well, you need more than a hammer and a screwdriver. I mean, there's some basic things that you need as us guys. We need, and that you might graduate into power tools down the road. And I might do some podcasts about that. But we talk about both soft and practical skills, anything that relates to, boys and men growing up, or boys growing up and young men. And so recently you were one that that I reached out to, but I began reaching out and trying to see if I can find people like yourself. You're working with young boys and young men that are athletes and are, that transition, what that's going to look like, which I think is what you're doing is, man, I just think it's phenomenal. I've never heard of anybody doing that. And I just think that the mental aspect, right, of how important that is, which I think a good part of what I'm doing is the same. It's a lot of this is mental, right? Fighting through and pushing through and succeeding in life. And I had another gentleman by the name of James McLam. James McLam is one of the founding members of a program called the Generation Ziegler. And if you're familiar with, some of your listeners might be familiar with motivational, inspirational speakers. Right. And I know that can sort of have a tint to it depending on who you are. But
sure,
nevertheless, I think there can be some value added to that. And he had him on, and he helps young people to be able to be good speakers and be able to learn how to network and to communicate and be able to actually, I think he said 3 or 4 of them become full-time public speakers of going out and just encouraging others. And then lastly, I don't want to fail to mention Jonathan Catherman. He is a best-selling author and a fellow that writes a number of books primarily for young people. And he just released a book, and here I'm promoting it. But I love what he's doing. But he just wrote a book called Raising Them Ready, which helps them from age 2 to 22 and how to handle life and how to prepare for life. And so he's a good author. So I guess to wind this down, anybody that I feel that can contribute to young men, I want them to have them on. And those are some of the people that I've had more recently.
Yeah, we're very similar in that respect. I think I've gotten to a point now where I'm constantly looking for different perspectives on, I say development, call it development, right? So I'll go back to the handshake example. I think that's a perfect example of something that is never, ever taught, right? We either learn it by watching or doing, but nobody ever says to us like, hey, did you think about trying that? Or what about this? Or, right? And we just sort of learn that. That's one example, but there's so many things in our lives. If you think about, like, if I think about my childhood and my growing up, like I just learned stuff on my own. I learned it when I moved out to go to college. I learned it when I started working. Like there are just things that you just like realize like, oh, I'm not doing this the way I should be doing it. So I have to sort of learn by watching. But if somebody were to tell me when I was 15 or 14 or 16, like, hey, think about this, look the person in the eye, this is the way, right? Like it's a tip that can put you in a better position sooner. Right. And I think that something else you said that I think is really important, and maybe it ties together, is, your comment about Generation Ziegler, right? Like to your point, right? Like there is sometimes people look at that sort of motivational type of speaking or the motivational people out there as sort of with some skepticism. And the way I look at the world is, I'm not going to give you my opinion. The way I look at the world is let's focus on the good and take the good and use the good versus criticizing on the things that you don't think are right or the things that you think are wrong, right? Like everybody has an opinion, but like, let's focus on the value in what those people are teaching. And I think that that's been one of the beautiful things about podcasting for me, is that you get to talk to people who have different perspectives and you can learn from them. You take the good stuff and you can leave what you want, but you don't have to criticize people. You can say, hey, that's a really good idea. Let's take it and use it. And everything else, maybe it doesn't work for me, but why are we going to focus on the negative?
Mike, can I take that a step further? And by no means, if there are people that, like you said, are skeptics, that's fine. But I challenge that from this perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, let me think about this. I have to. How many days? This would be a good exercise for me to. I may have to do this when we get done. How many days do we live on average? Let's say we consider ourselves from age 13 till we die. Okay, just track with me here a second. Okay. I don't know how many thousands of days, right?
Lots.
You're going to get up every single day and you have a choice to make the moment you wake up and you open your eyes. And let's just say we're just playing a game. Let's say that I don't know how you could enforce this, but we're just playing a fun game. Let's say that you have two options. You don't have any more options than this for the rest of your life. You either you get up or you wake up, and the first thing is you have to say some type of motivational, inspirational statement to yourself, or you say something negative for the rest of our lives. Like maybe society is turned to that way. It's almost like when we go get a drink of water, right? I know this is really, really radical, but do I even have to go any further with this story of where I'm headed? I mean, good grief.
No.
If we have a choice,
right?
I mean, what?
Right.
Okay, if we have a choice, and even though we don't think that motivation works, which I completely 100% disagree with that, I 100% disagree that that being inspired doesn't help us. Then what's the alternative? And look at what the alternative does. And I would bet you, I think we're tracking together, I would bet you after they did that and they started doing research, we're going to soon find out those people that succeeded, that are doing well, that are moving along in life are the ones that have said, you know what, today I'm going to make something of myself, versus the ones that said, I don't even know why I'm still here on earth. I mean, it's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's something that I comes up for me all the time in my work. And there's a noted, he's now since passed, believe it or not, this gentleman, Trevor Moawad, who was a mental performance coach, and he worked with Russell Wilson from the Seahawks and now the Broncos, and they were very, very tight. And his hypothesis, his view was, well, if you say something positive to yourself, is there a guarantee that it's going to work? No. But if you say something negative to yourself, then that's almost a guarantee that it's not going to help you. Right. Yeah. So you may have a neutral perspective, right? And that's better than being negative. You might not think anything you might not have a point of view. You might just say, hey, it is what it is. That's better than saying, hey, this really sucks. Because to your point, attitude is a choice, right? If you say something negative to yourself, I'm not happy about this, or this is crappy, or like this is happening to me, you're almost certainly not going to help yourself. And so why? Why choose that other than to maybe make yourself feel better? But it's not really having the intended effect long term. It might help you cope in the moment, but it's really not going to serve the purpose long term. And I think that the world can serve to use more positivity, and I think it's just, everybody learns at their own speed too, and what I mean by that is that, it's not until you really need it and you need some sort of faith or some sort of real, connection to something bigger than you that it's almost like out of desperation.
Well, and negative thinking and negative dialogue, negative self-talk.
Yes.
Here's what I think people don't get. Okay. What they don't get is, well, what do words have to do with it? What that does is it produces a momentary pause in your life. Okay. If I'm going to climb a tree and I'm afraid of heights, if I say to myself, I don't know that I can do this, the very first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to pause. I'm not going to move forward in any way, shape, or form. If I say to myself, I'm going to climb that tree. Now, maybe there's a pause, but if I continue to say that and I speak that and I believe that, my chances of moving sooner, moving more quickly, accomplishing the goal. Now, here we are. Here's where we're at right now. We're getting it down to real brass tacks of succeeding. There's a better chance that it's going to happen sooner than later. And then somebody can say, well, what's the point of it being sooner or later? Guess what? Now you're moving on to something else. Mm-hmm. And the more we say, I can't do that, I'm not going to do, I don't think I can do that. And then we finally get to that point, we could be 2 or 3 steps ahead in life if we were to continue to tell ourselves, I can do this, I can manage this. And then now we find ourselves a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road, and we're going, why am I still back here?
Right. Well, I mean, you've tapped into some pretty fundamental concepts in sports psychology, things that I would work on with athletes, which is to say, the way we talk to ourselves or the things that we think affects the way we feel about ourselves, which then affects our performance or what we do. So when I ask athletes the question of like, well, if you're thinking negatively, how are you going to feel? I'm not going to feel very good. Well, if you don't feel very good, how are you going to play? I'm not going to play very good, right? So that self-talk means a lot. Now, the flip side of it is if we tell ourselves something, if we try to affirm something for ourselves or tell ourselves we can do something that maybe is unrealistic, that can also lead us to demotivate, right? So for me, it would be, I'm going to climb that tree. I don't really want to climb that tree, and I'm not sure I can even get to the top. But what I can do is I could take one step and see what happens. Right. Okay, I took that step and I'm safe, right? I could take another step. Because what you described, right, is once you say, like, I can't do something, it's a threat. You do pause and you're saying, like, I don't want to put myself in the harm's way. It's a survival instinct. So you're like, once you tell yourself you can't do something, you're thinking, like, something bad is going to happen. So why am I going to put myself in harm's way? I'll just not do it. It's easier. As opposed to saying, I don't know if I'm going to get to the top, but if I take 3 steps today and I stop, tomorrow I'm going to take 4. And the day after, I'm going to take 5. And it's to go back to that, what we were talking about before, it's that self-referenced, competence. Like, hey, I can do this, right? Like, I am doing better than I did yesterday. And then in 2 weeks, if I climb the tree, I did it. Now I can climb a taller tree, right? It doesn't always have to be like on that first try. And I think that's what happens a lot of times with young people is there's this sort of all or nothing mentality, this perfectionism, which I see with young people, particularly young men of, hey, like, I can't make a mistake. Can't do this. I can't do that. I have to be perfect. If I'm not perfect, it's going to look bad. And that is something I work really hard on letting them know that it's okay to make mistakes, but you've got to learn from it. And you've got to have a positive attitude. You've got to have a good attitude, and you've got to be working on it constantly and invest in the process because it might not happen overnight. It might have to take some time. And if you're okay with that, you're going to get to where you want to go, maybe just not as fast as you thought it was going to take to get there.
Yeah. Preach it, brother.
I will. And that's, but I think it's important, right? It's important to have these kinds of conversations to understand that ultimately there's a choice, right? If somebody gets on and listens to this podcast with Mike and Tim talking, they might choose to say, I don't really believe that crap, right? That's okay. But deep down inside, does anybody really believe that? They just don't want to believe it because it's hard to take the next step, but at least you're planting the seed of, hey, like if you think about it in a different way, you're going to be able to do a lot of the things that you don't think you can do. And that's the way I look at it, because not everybody's ready to change or accept advice or suggestions the day they get them, right? It might take a little bit of time, but at least we're having the conversation to say, hey, if you want some help, it's here. And that's what you're doing on your podcast.
I think it's all about timing too, right?
Mm-hmm. I agree.
I often feel like, whatever. Sometimes I'll drop a seed of wisdom for my son, for example, and I'll think to myself, and my daughter too, and I'll think to myself, years ago or whatever, I'm like, they're not getting this. This isn't getting through. They're not. And then lo and behold, 6 weeks, 6 months, or 2 years later, there's a conversation, or I see this playing out and them playing out exactly what I said they need to do. And you're like, hey, wait a minute. So they're actually, well, a seed is the way I was explaining that. And it's sort of, it's growing now a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think with what we're doing, Mike, I think, as we're moving on, I'm well into moving into my second year of podcasting. I don't care when people show up. I don't care what condition they're in. I don't even care if they're naysayer, but maybe at some point, something that I've said will be of value. I know when I was starting to do this podcast, I was having a conversation with my father-in-law, really, really good guy. And we were sharing a little bit about this, and he's interesting. He's very just very realistic, extreme realism. I mean, you'd almost look at it as negative, but he tries to speak to you from a truth perspective. And he said, I want to ask you a question. He said, if you do this podcast a year and you have one listener, you can still do it. And I had to stop for a minute, because he said, you can have passion all day long, but is it to the point that you don't care, that you're just going to pursue this? And he says, I don't think that's going to happen. But he said, the point I'm making is, how bad do you really want to do this? And if it's to the point that one listener listens, and I pondered that for a few minutes, and I came back to him and I said, you know what? I can answer that to say this. If I can at least get just one young man to tell me that this made a difference, then it was worth everything that I've put into it. And it was probably, I want to say 2 months ago, I got that validation. And just through an exchange on Instagram, a young man had just followed up with me and just said, I listened to you the very first thing Monday morning when it drops as I'm going to school. And he said it's hugely beneficial. And then he says he is a junior instructor at a jiu-jitsu school.
Okay.
And he has about 4 or 5 young boys that are, 10, 11, 8 years old. And he says, a lot of what you present, I find myself presenting to these young men. Sorry, Mike. I can get very emotional.
Yeah.
Because that's what we're trying to accomplish, right?
Of course.
I mean, isn't that at the heart of everything that we do? Is not that I need validation, but that my desire is some kid out there is saying, yeah, I think some of this stuff is probably something I should listen to, right?
Yeah.
So whether it's someone that's now, sort of circling back to what you said, or whether it's 5 years from now that some kid listens to this episode, man, that to me, it was worth all of the time and the effort put into it.
I completely relate to that. And I get emotional too. I get people who come back to me and they'll say, thank you for doing what you do or how you help me. And that is what it's about. Right. And even though we don't do it for that reason, it does contribute to the motivation to keep going at a certain level, because, we can be as internally motivated as we are to do this at our own expense, probably at a loss. We're spending money, we're spending time, right? And it's not about that. So, you can keep going forward and doing it. But like when someone comes back and says, hey, I listened to this and it was shit. If someone tells me that they just listened, it's like, I won. Right. And oh, wow, you're really listening to me and what I have to say. It's really incredible. And I think that it's a noble thing to do. Especially when you have the intention of trying to help people. And that's the only reason I do what I do. Obviously we all have to make a living and we all have to do what we have to do to take care of our families. But when I get up every day, that's what I get up to do, is to help other people. And you obviously have that same motivation. And I think it's really cool and important to be able to do that. So as we sort of wind down a little bit here, I have to ask you, what's your favorite part of being a podcaster?
My favorite, that's a really good question. I've never been asked that before. What's my favorite part of being a podcast? I could go in a lot of different directions. A couple of things. Oddly enough, I enjoy public speaking. I think I've done it off and on throughout my life, and I've found myself really enjoying that. As I say sometimes on my episodes, that I like to flap my jaws. And I enjoy that. I think the other part of it is what we were just talking about. I like to inspire, encourage, motivate, offer wisdom to these young boys. I think there's value in that. If I can say that humbly, I think there's some type of value there. And as far as the podcasting in general, I'll tell you what is really unique about this. And you and I talked about it. Just so amazing how us podcasters, we actually want to help each other succeed. I don't know of any other industry in America. Maybe they were in the other parts of the world, but at least in America, I mean, Lowe's and Home Depot have a deep grudge against each other. Okay. And I'm not picking them out for any particular reason.
No, that's a great example,
anybody,
right?
you know, Walmart and Amazon or whoever, whatever the big guys are. There is this idea that it's just fighting tooth and nail for every, you know, half cent that's out there. And I had no idea that when you get into podcasting, it is a community. It is a group of people that are saying, hey, maybe I get 1,000 downloads a day and you get 50 a week. It doesn't matter, man. Let's get together and help each other increase our listeners. And I can help you and you can help me. And I've also found too, that outside sources like authors and musicians and people, man, they're more than willing to come on. Now, of course, I get it. They're getting
we're all promoting ourselves at some level, but that's okay.
Of course.
Yeah.
But what's wrong with that? But the point is that there's such a nice community, just you and I for this matter. This is how we started of it, exchanging and having conversations on a collaborative website. And here we are. So that even lends itself for me personally to even enjoying podcasting even more than I thought I would, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think you hit on something that's really been great for me, which is to say, I feel like when I have a conversation with somebody on a podcast, whether it's 30 minutes or an hour or whatever it is, I feel like I know them really well, like really personally after one conversation. Because if you think about the world we live in, you don't sit and have a 30 or a 60-minute conversation with a stranger anywhere, anytime, anywhere. We're getting together for the purpose of talking about something that's really substantive. And after an hour of having those conversations, you feel like you not only know that person, but you feel like you can trust them because you just had this really deep conversation about something that was really important to them or you or both. And like, that's a really cool thing where you start to build relationships with people just through these conversations that then we're sharing with the world, right? Maybe it's 50 people, 5 people or 5,000 or whatever it is. But there's a lot of value in it for me beyond just using it as a promotional vehicle. Because it is. We live in a world where content is king and people were looking for things to listen to and watch and all that stuff. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But is it done with love? Is it done with care? Is it done with the intent of doing something good? If it is, then people will listen. And that's a win-win for everybody. And I think there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. And that's how you and I got to know each other because I've interviewed you for my podcast and that's how this relationship started. And as soon as we got to the end, I was like, yeah, I like this guy. This was fun. But I love that's a good point. You know, you're right. There's very, very seldom do you get to know somebody almost instantly in any other type of industry. So that was a good point. I like that.
Yeah. And for me, I'll just add my favorite part about it is like, I'm a really curious guy. My favorite part is getting to know other people and asking them questions about their life and their experiences and what they know, because I learn from it. If nothing else, I learn from the people that come onto my podcast. And like, if nothing else, like if this ever ends, like I've learned a whole bunch of stuff,
Absolutely.
And there's a whole bunch of stuff that lives in perpetuity that people can access to learn from. That's a pretty cool thing to be able to do.
Yeah.
And so with that, the last question I will ask you is, and I ask this question to everybody, if there's one piece of advice or one thing that you would share with someone listening, let's call it the target audience, which is sort of a teenage young man, what is that piece of advice? What would you share with them?
The one piece of advice that I was given that, and actually hasn't been very long ago that I needed, was to not let the past dictate your future. There is an enormous amount of mistakes that I've made. There are a number of circumstances that I found myself in that I wish I hadn't. There were decisions that I made that I wish I could go back and change. None of that matters. Doesn't matter one iota. What matters is what I'm doing today to set myself up for the future. And by the way, let's use those mistakes. Let's use history, right, to learn from. Let's use history to not repeat it. I think a good majority of some of those people that don't learn are those that just continue to repeat the same bad habits and the same issues that they've dealt with in their past.
Mm-hmm.
So my encouragement to your young listeners is I could care less what your background is. I could care less what your color is. I could care less about whether you come from high pollutant type to, poor, nothing in your past makes any difference to what your future can be. And keep in mind, and we could go on, but my one point is just start now changing your tomorrow.
I love it. It's a good way to end. Tim, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to speak with you again. I appreciate it. I think we have some really good conversations. So I enjoyed this one, and hopefully it kind of got you energized for the rest of the day.
Absolutely. This was a blast, man. I loved it. Thanks for waking me up.
All right. I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
Thanks again. So, what's your biggest takeaway from my conversation with Tim Williams? My biggest takeaway is that I would have benefited greatly from having more mentorship during my teenage years. Like Tim, I had to figure out many things on my own, and probably way later in life than I could have if I had more adult guidance. My suggestion to parents is to make a concerted effort to share your wisdom and experiences with your kids. My suggestion to young people is to be intentional about surrounding yourself with good role models that will point you in the right direction for the rest of your life. I want to thank Tim for his kind generosity and the wisdom he shared with the Freshman Foundation community. You can learn more about the Thrivehood Podcast at www.thrivehoodpodcast.com and on Instagram at Thrivehood_podcast. To learn how mental performance coaching can help your mind work for you rather than against you, visit michaelvhuber.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you back soon for episode 49.
Mike Huber is the founder and owner of Follow the Ball Coaching, located in Fairhaven, New Jersey. He is a mental performance coach and business advisor dedicated to serving athletes just like you reach their full potential on and off the court. The Freshman Foundation is all about helping you get to the next level. For more information, follow along on Instagram at the Freshman Foundation. Please subscribe. Give us a like on iTunes, Spotify, leave a review, tell a friend. Most importantly, come back in 2 weeks, ready to get better.